welcome to the podcast, Sarah Olivieri. I'm so excited to have you here today.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
So I first want to dig into your work at Pivot Ground. Tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and what you're most excited to work with your clients on.
I love getting results. I like it when things work. And I came to my current work, which is teaching nonprofit leaders, mostly CEOs, executive directors. I like to call them CEOs. We can dig into that if we want. I like to help teach them how to run their nonprofits better so that they're getting a bigger impact without all that overwhelm and burnout, because I really think that all that overwhelm and burnout is a symptom that comes from not doing it well. And so you can really have a win-win when you do it well. And I came to this, I ran nonprofits. I've been a program director, office administrator, conference coordinator, founder, first executive director of a corporate sponsored foundation. So I've kind of worn all those hats. And then I did a big shift into marketing and owned several for-profit businesses. And as I grew a marketing agency, I came right back to nonprofits. And I was like, you know what? I like to get results. And my nonprofits aren't getting amazing marketing results from my amazing services because they don't run well enough. And great marketing kind of requires you to run consistently, quickly, right? Both of those things. And my clients were neither. And so I was like, I got pulled in. I actually had a client who said, will you come help us change the way we're running? And I was like, ooh, that sounds so fun, which is not true for everybody. But it was for me. And at that point, I shifted my work to what I'm doing now. And probably the most unique thing is I was a reluctant consultant, because I had already learned if you give people a plan, they're not going to execute your plan. I mean, chances that they're going to do it without you are slim to none. And that just
100%,
right? It just gets under my skin. I'm like, no, we must get results. So I was like, how can I teach them to make a better plan? And when it's their plan, they will execute it. It might not be as amazing as the plan I would have created, but at least it gets executed, and that's worth way more.
This is such a very simple analogy, but this is what's coming to mind. It's like we both were parents. I'm thinking about specifically my son, trying to get him to have maybe a wider palate and introduce new food. If I make something crazy, which isn't even that crazy, he's not going to eat it. But if he's cooking with me, he has some buy-in. He's making the plan versus me saying, here is a bunch of food that might seem intimidating or weird or smells different. He's not in, he's done. But if he's in the kitchen with me, he's got some buy-in to it, and it's a process he can replicate again and again. So that's what I was picturing as you were speaking.
Absolutely. So through that work, I created what I now teach along with my coaching called the impact method, which is a framework for developing plans, executing plans, and keeping the whole team coordinated. And as I was developing it, I probably didn't even realize the extent that I know now is that part of the reason why nonprofits struggle so much with this coordination of everything that needs to happen is because as businesses, they're just more complex than for-profit businesses. It's not actually that their leaders are less good at business, right? There's so much in the nonprofit space like corporate FOMO, but really when you put corporate people into the nonprofit space, they go in thinking, oh, I'm from the corporate space and I know how to fix this. And then they get in there, it's like the vortex.
Yeah.
Right. But it's really because nonprofits are more complicated. There's more people per dollar. There's multiple businesses going on at the same time.
That's what I think, almost from a sales lens, it's like you're selling to two different audiences as a nonprofit, because you're fundraising is selling, right? That's one audience. And then whatever it is your service or program is, that's a different audience, right?
It is.
Versus a for-profit where you're like, listen, I'm just trying to sell this mug. That's B2C all day. Right. One specific person in mind we can get in. So yeah, they are, we hear the analogy of wearing a lot of hats, but it's true.
And
right?
then you throw in a board of directors, which really only for-profit publicly traded companies have, and they have problems with their board of directors. But there's a really big difference between publicly traded companies' board of directors and nonprofits' board of directors. And that's in a publicly traded company, the board they're true literal stakeholders. They literally have shares of stock. And when they make terrible decisions, they pay with their money. And on a nonprofit board, when board members make bad decisions, or when the board as a group makes a bad decision, they really don't suffer at all. They might be a little embarrassed.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just
it's
a whoopsies.
And usually nobody knows about it outside of the board.
So do you wish it was the other way? Do you wish that there was some skin in the game or something? I'm thinking about Succession. So I watched Succession, and their board is going through an acquisition and this giant, conglomerate. And yes, boy, do those board members care, because they're stakeholders. And if the deal falls through, all of their value goes to zero, right? The company. Yeah. So like they have a lot of buy-in. They're very, very engaged and staying up, showing up to the meetings, making the connections, doing all the things, having a lot of skin in the game.
So I kind of wish they did, but I'm not too worried about it, because you know who has a ton of skin in the game? Executive directors and other C-suite level staff at nonprofits, if they're big enough to have them, because their job is on the line. They're extremely passionate about it, right? They're already giving way more than their salary to this position. And when they make a bad decision, not only are they likely to lose their job, but they might lose their career, right? Yeah. Their reputation, all executive directors, right? Their reputation, they operate on trust, right? Building that trust. And when they lose people's trust, they might not get another job. And they're also, most executive directors I know, right? They are extremely dedicated. Like they have dedicated their life to this mission. So there's a lot of intrinsic skin in the game, way more than board holders would have, but they have real financial skin in the game. And, money has a powerful role to play.
Yeah. I love that distinction. So we're going to dive into boards today. That's what we're going to talk about. And one of the things we previously chatted about was really this idea of best practices for boards and, why they don't work, why the old way doesn't work. And I know that I was like, yes, tell me more, tell me all the things. So let's talk about boards, the way that it's been done, why it's been done that way, and reimagining a better way.
Yeah. So for years I said, I don't do boards. I'd been on boards. I didn't like them even when they were running well. It was always annoying. I saw boards do ridiculous things. Like I joined a board and then I realized they weren't taking minutes or even voting on anything. They were just kind of loosely making decisions. And I was like, you kind of have, like, it's actually the law. You kind of have to like vote on stuff. And they're like, oh, you're so mean, Sarah. You're so annoying. And I was like, no, it's just, the basics. But finally, year after year, I would see issues coming up, even with my own clients who clearly it wasn't a leadership issue. It wasn't that boards were struggling because their leaders weren't doing a good job, because these are only leaders who are choosing to work for a year with me in my program. Like these are dedicated leaders focused on improving themselves. And still the board stuff was making their jobs harder. And I would ask my clients, what percentage of your time do you spend managing board expectations and doing board communication? You want to guess what they said?
Oh, no.
Take a guess.
I'm scared that it's too much. I'm scared that it's way too much.
20%. 20% of all of their whole job running their entire organization was just spent
liaisoning
with the board to keep them up to speed. And I was like, that is not a good use of an executive director's.
Like my arms are crossed. I'm sitting back. I'm covering my face. I'm frustrated just thinking about that. It's like, let me loop you in. Let me loop you in. No, you're the CEO. You're the ED. Like we got to get shit done. Stop.
That's right. That's right.
So tell us more.
So I finally decided I got to do something about this, right? Like we can't have boards getting in the way of progress, right? Then we don't get the results. And I really like getting the results, right? We're not making an impact. And that just really doesn't sit well with me. So I decided I was going to create a board training. And so first thing I did, like most things I do, is I did a deep dive, nerdy research session. So first I went to, what are considered the common best practices. And if you look up like, a board job description or what are boards responsible for, you'll find one version or another of this list of 10 or 12, occasionally it's 8 board responsibilities, and kind of the keeper of the list is probably Board Source, right? And you can find their things. And they're the same 12 things over and over again. So my first question was, well, is there any research showing that this list actually produces more impact than something else? And that's where the red flags started going off. Because as I looked, I found a lot of research around whether or not boards were following those best practices. But I couldn't find any research on whether or not those so-called best practices produced more impact. And that's when I was like, ooh. So my next question then was like, well, where did this list come from? And first I found that it was codified in the late 1990s.
Okay.
But everyone was already kind of using basically the same list already. So it's like, well, where does that list come from? And then I got really deep into the history, and all of a sudden I was back in the 1600s
Wow.
and the formation of Harvard and the colonies, right? So the Protestants are coming over to the Americas. They don't want, so in England, right, church and government are the same, and they want a different church. So they kind of also need like different kind of government. And they are setting up the first corporations. And this is when the first kind of nonprofits, and really the first nonprofit, is basically Harvard. And because literally the Protestants are like, we need to train our own leaders in our way for the future, right? Very total self-interest here, right? And one of the early directors of Harvard, he needed to incorporate Harvard. It wasn't incorporated, right? It was questioned like, who owns property? This is all like money, land, ownership, power stuff going on. And so this president of Harvard actually creates what I think is a brilliant leadership model. He had 2 boards. One board was made up of teachers, essentially, who worked at Harvard. And they were all up in the business. They were the executives of Harvard, and they were the decision-making board. So it was a group of people who made decisions for the organization. And there was a second board that only had veto power, and they could like visit and look around, but they didn't have any other decision-making power. But then wealthy people on the non-decision-making power side who are giving big bucks to Harvard, guess what they want?
They
want power, right?
Yeah. They want to say, yeah.
So it's too much for a podcast, right? But let me just say that there were years, like 50 or more years of legal battles, right? This whole history is legal battles between this growing class of wealthy businessmen, professionals. Literally, if you read the history, it's like clergy, lawyers, merchants, right? All the wealthy, powerful white business men, right? And they're all vying for power. And it's not just about nonprofits. This is power, like who owns government, right? How's the public represented? Can it only be represented through government? They just got through saying it's not government and church can't be. We don't want it to be the same thing, right? There's like so many power struggles going on in our whole history of nonprofits. And that list basically comes out, this original Harvard guy's separation of kind of the real board that were really executives, like a board of executives, and then like an ex officio board who just has veto power, that gets scrapped. Because the people with the money and the power keep pushing in, and they are the ones. And that is where that list we're using today comes from, those legal battles of the wealthy, powerful continually pushing in. And you see it show up in history again and again, and again and again, right up through, probably the 1950s is the last time it kind of really flares its head in the legal situation where unrelated business income tax, right? Like nonprofits today can't run a kind of for-profit style business to make money, but they used to be able to before 1950. And the reason why they were allowed to make money however they wanted, as long as the profits went back into the charitable, into the mission.
Yep.
But the for-profits were jealous and they thought the nonprofits had an unfair advantage in doing business. And they lobbied and made it against the law for nonprofits to do that. And that's probably the last time we see this battle in the courts and changing law.
Wow. And it's one of those moments where it's like, there are so many aspects of our life where we accept things as, I don't even know, normal, just how it is. And it's like, you peek under that and you're like, hold on a second. And this is one of those moments for sure.
Yeah. So I couldn't, help but say, okay, well, what if we just scrap just temporarily, right? Whenever I'm planning, let's just temporarily scrap everything we know and say, what is our purpose, right? Because my purpose in running nonprofits is not to have a power struggle between the wealthy and politically connected. It's to make an impact. That's what I'm always measuring by, like, what makes the biggest impact? What gets the best results for achieving that mission? And I started to rethink, okay, what are the things? What would it really look like? What would the job of the board look like? And more recently, I've even questioned things like, there's that advice, like you should have a lawyer and an accountant. And it's always guised as, because they'll know how to kind of think about financial strategy or legal strategy. But recently, as I was kind of reviewing some of this history again, and I kept seeing like, clergymen, attorneys, business people, I was like, could that have been just kind of codified in to make sure that those people
have a seat at the table? Yeah.
So even that now I'm kind of doubting, because I already was like, I'd rather the nonprofit have an attorney who is being paid to do attorney work for them than have an attorney on the board kind of doing pro bono, and you don't really know if that attorney's specialty is.
God, I just want to just underscore, highlight, shout that part for the rooftops is I can feel the organization listening to this going, well, hang on, it's smart to have an attorney on our board, and here's why. But then going, wait, is it smart for you to have a real estate attorney on your board who knows nothing about what it is that you come to them having questions about, when you could just pay somebody to do that, right? And you know, a well-run board, you would have the funds to pay somebody who is an expert in your sector, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm all for nonprofits having enough money and resources, or enough money to buy the resources they need. And if you need legal advice, I mean, there is nothing, we talk about conflict of interest all the time, but I like to talk about confluence of interest, right? Like, how do we grease the wheels and make people more likely to do things for us? Yeah. And it's usually by paying them, like people ask me all the time, like, well, how can we get our volunteers more engaged? We need this work done. Or how can we get our board more engaged? We need this work done. I'm like, if you need the work done, you pay people
Sounds
to
like
do
a job.
The work.
Yeah. Sounds
and
like
then
a job,
they do
you guys.
The work. And, it doesn't take that much fundraising savvy, but just a little bit goes a long way in starting to bring in the funds to be able to pay people to do the work you need done. And life is so much easier when you use money the way money is designed to be used.
So paint the picture, your vision for what's possible when we are rethinking the structure of a board. We're rethinking this. Walk me through that. Like, walk me through what your clients have been able to do when they rethink a board.
Well, I'll tell you a story of a real client who, when they started with me, they started, being like, yes, I'm a new executive director and I'm going to run this organization so much better. And the board just like within a couple of weeks imploded from drama and power struggles. And so first there was, some massaging to like get the board to even come around, but the board comes to the board retreat that I developed, and those who were remaining, because a bunch of them just left, right? And if you have a ton of power struggles on your board, honestly, you need to navigate the situation so that those people who are looking for power bow out, because that is not what board seats should be for. Gaining personal power and influence.
Yep.
So this nonprofit was able to clean up their board, and now they have a board that watches, even though their board no longer they make very few decisions. Their biggest decision is who's going to be new on the board, right? That's their biggest one. But now that they're not making decisions for the most part, they are watching and supporting more than they ever did before.
Yeah.
It's like having that, when you're a board member and you're like at a nonprofit and you're responsible, it's like being a parent, right? If you're responsible for a kid that you really have little control over, I have a kid who is he's very smart, but there is not an ounce of obedience for obedience sake in his body, right? Like,
I'm only laughing because I understand.
yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of parents, right? I've told parents, like, it's nice that you stood your ground through that tantrum one time and a couple hours later, or like an hour later, you were through it. I'm like, my kid, he's finally, now that he's 10, is through it. But for years, he could easily hold a 5-hour tantrum. And on the cases usually I can't survive past 3 hours in tantrum zone. That's my personal limit, right?
Wow. I think mine's like an hour before I'm like, I have to tag out.
And just because you made it through one tantrum holding your ground doesn't mean it isn't going to happen again and again and again.
That's right.
And again.
That's
and,
right.
and again. Right. So anyway, so I almost lost track here, right? So the board let go of all these decisions, and now they're super, super supportive. So it's scary. So my point was, it's scary to be responsible for something you have very little control over. And that's the position we have asked with that old list our boards to be in. We've asked our boards to be responsible for having enough funds when they're not fundraising professionals. They're not paid to do the fundraising work. This is like a department's job, not a volunteer's job, right? Raising hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And so once, I think with this board, once they were no longer had that fear that came with being responsible, they got much more interested. And the executive director started saying, oh, my board's now asking, how do these budget line items match up to achieving our mission goals? They never asked that before. And all of a sudden they're not approving budgets and they're all interested in the way.
Yeah.
So it almost seems counterintuitive, but I think it makes sense. And what's happening with the nonprofit, as far as the rest of the organization, is before the conversations that the leadership conversations the executive director were having with me were things like, I need to hire staff, but how can I get my board to approve it? There were all these limitations, and she was always trying to operate.
That's the number one question. How can I get my board to approve it? How many times we get asked that? All right, keep going. Tell us.
So now that she doesn't ask that question anymore, she has added many more staff and lots more money. And now she comes to coaching calls and she's like, I just sit here and the opportunities like fall in my lap. And they are big. I mean, this is an organization, their budget is well under $1 million. And she's got Apple calling her. She's got Sony courting her, saying, how can we help more? What else can we do?
And let's just put a pause here and say, she's not a unicorn, right? She's not a unicorn. Like she is not a just magical being who this suddenly happened for. So what makes her different? Like what makes the way that she is thinking like a CEO, the way that you could maybe give us some context too of like, how did she, together with the board, take away the board, will you please approve this, and say, you know what, I'm making the decisions? Like, what did that look like? Let's dig into that a bit more.
Yeah. So it's really hard for a board to hear it from the executive director, right? Because they know that at the end of the day, they're in a way responsible for that executive director. And it might seem like a conflict of interest for the executive director to say, hey, give me all the control. Right. Sure. Like, so instead they heard it from me. And, some of that included the history that we just talked about. Some of it included me teaching that board everything that goes into running a nonprofit, because let me tell you, most boards don't know, they don't see how
They don't
complex it is.
know.
And once they see it, they go, oh, now we understand why our executive director is wanting all these things. And they also are very much in a position saying, yeah, we don't want to decide on that stuff because we have no idea how any of this stuff works. They want to let go. Most boards really want to let go. And I actually had that board chair who was the chair through all of the drama and stayed the chair on the other end. He asked me, he said, hey, Sarah, so let me just ask you, like, why would anyone want to join the board if they don't have any power? And I was like, well, why would you? You seem to still want to be on the board. You seem to like what I'm saying. Do you need to have power to feel like your role on the board is important? And he said, no. He's like, he likes it even better. He wishes all of the boards he were on were like this. And I was like, that's because you're the kind of board member we're looking for. And there are a lot of people who would like to play a role saying, we helped make this happen. We provided a level of oversight and accountability. We were watching, we were there to see if something was going horribly wrong. And we don't need any decision-making power, right? To feel good about our role. And I think that desire to have decision-making power, I don't think anybody, there should be a balance between decision-making power and skin in the game, right? That's where you get equilibrium. And people who want power without skin in the game, that's always a red flag to me.
And that's something we're going to dig into. So for your workshop in June that you're hosting, is this appropriate for board members to show up to and executive directors? And like, is this a good way for, we've got a beautiful impartial guest, expert to talk about this dynamic, to talk about a different way to handle the responsibilities? Tell me,
yes.
What do you think?
So, in the workshop, basically what came out of all my research and all this work is a new job description for boards. One that, as one person who took it previously said, you should call this like the board job description that actually works. Like that actually works. Like, cause there are a lot of webinars out there and trainings are like, fix your board. I see Joan Gary has ads going all the time, fix your board. I've attended her webinar. I was really excited. This is before I did mine. I was like, oh, this is just the same stuff all over again, right? It's not actually new, but this is actually a new job description. I'm going to teach it in the training, what that is. It's actually very easy because it's a lot less to do. So your board can come, the leadership can come, everybody can come and benefit from understanding what to do instead. And everybody who's done the training is like, responds like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. Or I've had a number of people say, we were actually kind of doing that way, but we were worried like that there was something
we were doing
wrong.
It wrong. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
100%. We're not.
So they needed the validation. Yeah.
Oh,
and then
I love
for
that.
those of you who, if you can't get your board to come, or if your board comes and they're still like, oh, like how do we actually change? In the fall, I'm going to offer a board retreat that your board can attend. And one of the things I'm really excited about is really good board retreats, facilitated board retreats are often like really expensive, many thousands of dollars. And, in everything I do, I was like, how can I get a bigger, better result for less money for my clients and less time for me? Because I'm also a busy mom and I got plenty of clients to serve. And I said, what if I could offer through the power of Zoom a board retreat for multiple boards at the same time?
Oh, that's smart.
And that's what we've been doing. And so I'm able to offer a custom board retreat for your board, and every board goes into their own breakout rooms to work on the things together. And I'm there to support every board. But because I'm able to bring multiple boards to the table, two amazing things happen. One is the cost for your board to have a day-long facilitated board retreat goes way down.
Yep.
But the results stay the same. And the other thing is potentially the results are even better because so many boards feel like it's just our board. And then they get in a retreat with other boards and they're like, literally every board is having the exact same challenges. And they go, oh, we're not alone. we see that so many other organizations are having the same challenges and they learn from each other.
So I'm thinking about the ED that might say, this sounds great, but I really need my board to fundraise for me. And I really need my board's help for X, Y, and Z. Like kind of that, it's resistance, but what's underneath that is like worry. Like if I put on my CEO hat and I start really decision making and I stop liaisoning 20% of my week, will that actually make my job harder, right? Because it'll all be on me. What do you say to that?
So when I hear executive directors saying like, I really need my board to fundraise, what I like to peel back for them is what you're really saying is you need more money and you need more support raising that money. And the best way to do that is take steps toward building a fundraising department, or what's often called a development department, right?
Mm-hmm.
And very high level I've coached a lot of organizations in building this, because when organizations come to me and say, our problem is money, I say, well, let's take a look. Who's in charge of raising the money? How much time do they have available to raise that money? And I'm like, well, you don't have anybody in charge, or the person you do have in charge has zero time to do it. That's root cause number one of why you don't have any money. And for those of you being like, but how? I'll just spell it out because it's not that complicated. I'm going to tell you right now how you do it. If you're a small organization going, but how, Sarah, how? You're the solo ED, right? You're the solo leader, right? You're in charge of everything. First, you hire an assistant. That assistant frees you up to do a little bit of fundraising. What type of fundraising should you focus on? Major gifts, nothing else, no grants, no social media, just
we want to go upstream, folks. No $20. Right. We want to go 20,000, 200,000 upstream.
3 to 5 major donors. That's what 3 to 5 people, right? Where this is not some grand hundreds of thousands of people we're coordinating. We're looking for 3 to 5 major donors.
Yeah.
Your assistant will give you enough time to go do that. Once you have done that, you now can afford to hire a development director or maybe a second assistant, or if that assistant was part-time and they're really good at helping with the fundraising things, you can upgrade them to fulfilling that function. Once you have somebody whose job it is full-time to focus on these fundraising activities, then you can start adding in things like, the more scaled up fundraising with lower amounts of donations, where you're going to do email marketing and you're going to do, social media if it's relevant. You're going to do all the outreach, but that stuff is like, right? That's labor intensive work. Just because it's digital doesn't mean it doesn't.
It's not set it and forget it. It's not a crock pot. It's not. Like if somebody, it's like, I'm thinking of a ship, right? And there's lots of holes in the ship. It's like a leaky ship. It's like one little social media campaign where you get, 100 donors at $20 is not going to do it, right? That's not going to plug those gaps. We need a bigger plug. We need more, and we need to go upstream and kind of stabilize before we could do some of those fun activations, because they are fun, or just organic, before we can really start doing organic, because organic marketing is a little bit of the slower game, right? That's that nurture, that stewardship, that trust building. And then we get that ripple effect that works really, really well. But when people come to me and they think a peer-to-peer campaign or a social campaign is going to fix it, it is like you peel that layer back and you're like, da, 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 da. What are we doing? I love the idea of like, let's go upstream, because one of the things I've been thinking about lately is, in a lot of ways, it's just as hard or easy to get a single gift of $10,000 as it is to get 100 donors to give $10. Do you know what I mean? Like the effort behind it.
It's only a little more work to get that one gift of $10,000 than it is to even get one gift of $10.
I'm with you. Like,
it's not that hard.
I see that true in my business. I see that true for a lot of clients. Like, I bet if you pick up the phone and put together some meetings and started doing some prospecting, you could secure a gift of $10,000 this week. It would be much harder for you to get a bunch of individual gifts to total $10,000. And so
absolutely. And really that, it's always harder, right, to get the first gift, and getting that first $10,000 gift can take a little bit of work. But once you have a donor at that level, donors, so I kind of break it down like this. All donors want to be able to say at the end of the day, I helped make that happen. That's what they
100%.
want to do, right? If you
Yeah.
can give them the information so that they can say, I helped make that happen, right? They feel great. But the major donors, people giving thousands of dollars, 10, 20, 80,000, 300,000,
Mhm.
they want to say, I helped make that happen, but they have an investor mindset usually,
Mhm.
which means one, they know already when they give to you that they're going to give to you again and again and again.
Mhm.
And they value, $10,000 isn't so much for them usually, right? This is
Yep.
easy. And if you blow it because you ran an experiment and you used it all up and it didn't produce results, they're down with that. That's the
Yeah.
nature of investing, right? We know we're going to try several times. So once you have that one, and I learned this from a client I had when I was still doing marketing, every time we needed money, his name was Steve, I'd be like, well, here's the project, but it's going to be $80,000. And he's like, all right, let me make a call. And like literally he would
Yep.
pick up his phone,
Yep.
he'd call one donor and say, hey, Bob, we want to do this really cool project, but we need another $80,000. Are you, can I count on
Yep.
you? And usually Bob would say, sure, Steve, just give me a couple days to transfer the money.
And again, Steve's not a unicorn.
Not a unicorn.
Steve's just Steve.
Steve's just Steve, right? But Steve knows better to spend his time making that one call than to, spend hours and hours doing, other types of fundraising, which are good too. But right, it's like we're making a cake, right? The base
That's
of
right.
the cake.
We got to do the foundational layers, and the foundational layers that will help you sleep at night is going upstream for those donations.
That's right.
Those gifts.
Then you add
100%.
on everybody else. Yes.
That's right. Then we get the wider involvement. Yes. One of the things that I like to tell my clients when they get a little like in the weeds on asking for money, they've got Steve who usually gives let's say $80,000. And they feel like, oh my God, if it wasn't for Steve. And I'm like, what if you found out today that Steve gives to 3 organizations and you're the lowest gift he gives? Like, what if 80 is like, he gives somebody else 800? And that blows your mind where you're like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. Suddenly that sort of that tie and that weirdness you have to Steve, you're like, hang on, I'm just going to pick up the phone and call him. Right.
Yeah. And that's so true. So one of my first experiences with major gifts was I was the deputy director of a nonprofit. And one day, one of the small donors, every year they came to the gala and they gave $2,500. Somebody who works for them called up and I was the person who answered the phone that day. And she was like, well, Sarah, what's the plan for the next few years of this organization? And the executive director is a visionary, but not so much of a planner. And so I was like, well, here's what we're thinking. Year 1, we do this. Year 2, we do this. Year 3, we do this. And this is how we're going to build it up. She's like, great. Thanks for sharing that with me. I was like, okay. Like a few days later, we get a letter in the mail with a check for $100,000 saying we're going to give you $100,000 3 years in a row in unrestricted giving. And at the time, that was like the entire organization's budget.
Wow.
Now, who's behind this money? So I can't tell you all the details, right? But so this is a very wealthy family who has a mega foundation that they give bajillions of dollars to, mostly for science research. But then they also have their family foundation where they just give hundreds of $1,000s to instead of millions and billions of dollars. And that's even so big that they hire an administrator who is the person who had called me to manage for them. And to give $300,000 for them is just a little,
it's fine.
We'll drop in the bucket. Yeah. No big deal. Like you lose it, you wait. I mean, we don't want you to waste it, but it's not a big deal. There is plenty more where that came from. The only reason I think why they spread it out over 3 years is because they weren't going to give more than the existing entire operating budget.
Right. Which again, that investor mindset, that would make sense, right? Is they're like, well, they're probably thinking about giving it through for a runway, right?
That's right. And all they needed to hear was we had some sort of plan that logically made sense.
Yes.
That's all they needed.
That's all they needed. Right. So we don't get to decide what people can and cannot afford. We get to ask, right?
That's right. we get to give them the opportunity to give. I like to say, you know, when you ask, you're giving someone an opportunity to be a part of what you're doing, which is really important. And if you don't ask, you're not going to give them the opportunity. And that's going to be bad for them.
Yes, 100%. I love that.
You're hurting your donors when you don't ask.
Yes. Let everybody let that sink in. You're hurting your donors when you don't ask. That's so good. So, okay. So everybody should come to our workshop together happening in June, invite your board, come, you're going to learn about how to reimagine the board, what their responsibilities should be, because we really didn't dig into too much of that today. That job description, like I'm excited to see that, because one of the things that I've built my business on is really not this rear view mirror thinking, is like, what is a way that is sustainable? What is a way where we're not overworking? What is a way that this organization grows so that we're all in this together so we can have a bigger impact? What does that look like? Right. So I'm very excited for this.
We're going to spell it out for you. And you're going to leave with a checklist that your board. So when your board's like, did we do a good job? They can literally go like, check, 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 check. That's going to make everybody on the board feel really, really good about their new job.
Yes. Instant dopamine response.
That's right.
Awesome.
I use an online tool and it dings when I check it. I feel so good every time. I'm like, ding. And I made it turn green too. So it's like fully gamified. I'm like, I got to make them all go green.
It works. It works for our brain. It reinforces. We do this. Yes. Anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up to the final question?
Oh, just, you know, for whatever you heard today, if you heard one thing that you can take action on it, because, you know, if you're only learning and you're not trying, like, be brave, be bold, like you're already in the business of changing the world. Like, what can trying something a little different hurt? That's right. So you've got this, and you should implement something right away.
Love that. So I ask every guest on the podcast, what is one thought that they like to think on purpose? This can be a belief, an affirmation, a mantra, or just something that like is a guidepost for you. Will you share that with us?
Yeah. So I have several, but the one that I'd love to share is one that changed my life. You can make up for lost money, but you can't make up for lost time.
Ooh, that's a great one.
Always remembering. In fact, recently I started hearing myself say, I don't set money goals, I set time goals. And then I figure out how much money I need to achieve those time goals, or how much money I need to make within that time. But I think if you realize that time is the most valuable resource in your life and in your business, and it's what brings everything together, and you start making that a focus, you will find so much more joy in your life and how you spend your time.
I love that so much. I will share that a few years ago, I was inspired by a friend of mine who's also an online business owner, Sarah Wiles, and she started tracking her time the way that like an assistant tracks her time. And so I track my time. I was like, I'm curious. Like I had a thought about how much time I worked in my business and how I didn't have enough time and how long things took me. But the truth was very different than what I thought. And it really was so cool. I still do it to this day. It helps me track my ROI. It helps me track my impact. And I highly suggest, if you're somebody who like struggles with time, to just start by like a baseline and start tracking your time.
Yeah, I love that. I also track my time. And recently I started paying myself hourly so that I could really root that time to a dollar number. Yeah. And in doing that, I just want to say this for all the busy parents out there, is that one thing I learned through tracking my time is that for me, working 90 hours a month in my business is unsustainable. It is too much. I also know that working 45 hours a month is too little. My business starts to crash. So I'm looking for the sweet spot. I'm guessing it's 60. But so much of the message we hear is that if I only work 90 hours a month, that should be some sort of luxurious thing. But if you have needy children, or other people you're taking care of, or you have some other passions in your life that you're pursuing and you're throwing in some self-care in there, it is possible that for you, so just in case you need to hear it, for me, 90 hours a month, not a week, is too much. That's burnout
mhm.
city for me. And
That's
that's
right.
okay. Right. And I
That's
think there
right.
are a lot of parents who need to hear that.
That's what I learned. And as I got better tracking my time, I started to work less in the business. I was able to hit an equilibrium where revenue would increase. And then my brain had to catch up with that. Like, oh my gosh, this is possible. This is possible. So yes, it's possible.
It is possible.
Where can people hang out with you? We'll link to the workshop in the show notes, but you're pretty active on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yeah, LinkedIn is a good place to find Mimi. You can find my business information at pivotground.com. You can also find me on Facebook, but if you really want to engage, try me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thanks so much for today.
Thank you.